Thank you, Pamela, and thank you for having me here. And I'd just like to echo to Professor Mainelli. Thank you for joining us, and we know it's late in the night for you where you are at. Just an introduction of you. Professor Michael Mainelli is the executive chairman of Zien Group. He is a qualified accountant, securities professional, computer specialist, and management consultant. He was educated at Harvard University and Trinity College Dublin. Michael gained his PhD at London School of Economics, where he was also a visiting professor of IT and innovation. His career spans scientific research, accountancy firm partner, and director of Ministry of Defense Research. His biggest technical claim to fame might be the first commercial digital maps of the world in the early 1980s. Amazing. Michael founded and chairs Zien, the City of London's leading commercial think tank, famous for its global financial and green finance centers indices. Michael is Emeritus Professor and Life Fellow at Gresham College, where he created a long finance initiative asking, when would we know our financial system is working? Good question, Michael. His third book, The Price of Fish, A New Approach to Wicked Economics and Better Decisions, won the Independent Publishers Book Awards Finance and the Investment and Economics Global Gold Prize. Michael was a British Society Director of the Year in 2005. He is also Alderman and Sheriff of the City of London from 2019 to the present moment. Welcome, everyone, and welcome, Michael. I look forward to your presentation, as I'm sure everyone else does.
Well, thank you very, very much, Melissa, for that generous introduction. And may I also thank Kamla for opening things today. Could you just confirm that we can see the slides? Is that
all clear?
Great, okay. Well, reframing the complexities of wealth is our topic today. I came to this conference because Bob Garrett posed this question on wealth, and I thought it was a particularly good challenge. So thank you, Bob. The Irish statesman Edmund Burke gives us a stern warning on wealth. He says, if we command our wealth, we shall be rich and free. If our wealth commands us, we are poor indeed. So how do we reframe the complexities of wealth for governance purposes? I'd like to start with three questions. What is wealth? What are wealth's complexities? How might we reframe wealth? And then I'd like to explore intergenerational wealth transfer and end with some thoughts and prejudices about the implications. So what is wealth? Well, the Oxford English Dictionary first defines wealth as an abundance of valuable possessions or money. Some of their subsidiary definitions touch on rich or prosperous or plentiful supplies. Under these definitions, wealth can be tabulated. But wealth has other connotations. In Middle English, wealth in turn derives from well or weal on the pattern of health. We have commonweal or commonwealth, a healthy and prosperous society. But even this first definition is problematic. Abundance, possessions, and money can conflict. For example, abundance depends on future expectations. At the start of the recent pandemic, in many locations, people believed they had a scarcity of toilet paper. Just days before, they had an abundance. Valuable to whom? To me as the owner, to others. For monetary purposes or sentimental reasons or utilitarian reasons. Such imbalances are the root of trade and possession. Now, my possessions are only my possessions if I can control them. Under normal conditions, the state takes this role as it has a monopoly on the use of force in a specified geographic area. Under abnormal conditions, my shotguns had better be more plentiful than those who covet my possessions. And finally, possessions and money are not strictly interchangeable. Possessions are illiquid assets, subject to the probability that an asset can be converted into an expected amount of value within an expected amount of time. By most theorists, money is considered to be an asset that is perfectly liquid. It can always realize its market value. And both possessions and money depend on science and community. society and community. Now, if we look at the ownership of possessions, financial instruments, or money, is not straightforward. The British lawyer Anthony Honore set out 11 aspects of ownership. He was trying to show how rich the owner or the subject could be. His conclusion was that a bundle of incidents established ownership, not a rigid checklist. There is no rigid set of characteristics for ownership. And this impedes some of the discussion on wealth. A cursory look at the law of ownership or the philosophy of ownership swiftly and sharply reminds us of this complexity. Owners and things, individual, communal, corporate and private, unitary and non-unitary, civil law versus common law, Marxist versus capitalists, space, temporal, natural wealth divisions, common land, air, water, forest, fish, fowl, animals, genes, marital and family ownership, tangible versus intangible, state and eminent domain, intellectual design, copyright, trademark, movable versus immovable, trusts, mortgages, estates and probates and wills and succession, gifts, contingent interests, servitudes, easements, covenants, public nuisance, zoning and regulation. Well, it's complicated. In an economic sense, Adam Smith was clear that wealth was based on labor. It was not by gold or by silver, but by labor that all the wealth of the world was originally purchased, and its value to those who possess it and who want to exchange it for some new productions is precisely equal to the quantity of labor which it can enable them to purchase or command. Anyway, I think it's obvious wealth is not straightforward. This is not a law review piece, and I am not a lawyer. So I want to touch on two big complexities that bedevil the governance of wealth, not subject you to inconclusive legal and philosophical intricacies. So for now, let's stick with that OED's first definition of wealth, an abundance of valuable possessions or money. Now, to use the term wealth is extremely emotive, itself indicating some lurking complexities. Obviously, wealth is not just material wealth. I contend that anyone who thinks they're counting their wealth doesn't know what they're counting. Because if they can count the value of family relations, friends, their education, their talents, or their home, they could only live in an impossible world. Bernard Meltzer, an American radio host, supposedly said, "The real measure of your wealth is how much you'd be worth if you lost all your money." Now, John Bates Clark, in the turn of century, last century, was a USA economist who published Philosophy of Wealth in 1886. His revolt against the spirit of the old economy argued that people were motivated as much by social interests as by self-centered personal interests. Wealth was not a natural phenomenon. Rather, it was a political creation, and economics was a limited domain of wealth. I would agree with Clark and encourage us to use an expansive view of wealth beyond economics, but I would also like to keep tonight's remarks pointed. So let's just explore two complexities, both complexities about the deep and implicit bond that any wealthy person, family, organization, or society has with the community of mankind. The first complexity has to do with liquid money. The second has to do with the threshold of abundance. Now, the liquid money complexity is the relationship between money and wealth. A community is a group of people prepared to be indebted to one another. Money is a technology that communities use to trade debts across space and time. Some communities are coercive or semi-coercive. In our world, where the nation-state paradigm is dominant, virtually everyone belongs to a nation-state, whether they like it or not. That nation-state requires them to pay taxes. The state also issues tax credits to get us to do things for the state. We call those tax credits fiat currency or hard cash. So the technology of finance that you use, the money in your purse or wallet, your credit card, shifts these tax credits around and binds your national community in indebtedness, both now and in the future. Now, in strong economies, it is easy to buy and sell with confidence. The ability to turn things into cash means that they are liquid. When governments issue money, they extend debts into the future, binding newborn babies together with aging pensioners, all using tax credits. With high levels of quantitative easing, this binding is intensifying. I ask you to recognize that wealth depends on the state using its monopoly on the use of force to ensure just private ownership. And we often transfer possessions into money to gain other possessions or to have more money. The transfer of possessions into monetary wealth increases our dependence on the state to not just safeguard our wealth, but also to safeguard the community's monetary system and value. Wealth is a social construct depending on other people, virtually everyone in your nation state. Now, the threshold of abundance complexity arises from a point I touched on earlier, that wealth depends on your expectation of surplus or deficit ownership. The Greek Stoic Epictetus said, wealth consists not in having great possessions, but in having few wants. We could tease you that once you move into wealth, your behavior changes to that of accumulating non-necessities. And this threshold between abundance and scarcity changes, just as it does with toilet rolls in a pandemic. Again, assessing wealth depends on assessing society and the state. In so many ways, our wealth is wider than just our possessions. I don't need those shotguns in a well-policed state. How much money do I need to save for health if healthcare is free, for unemployment when there are good social nets, for education if the state subsidizes it? The less volatility there is in the environment, the less I need to retain and the more abundance I have, i.e. wealth. So wealth is not just possessions, nor just labor we can purchase, Patche Adam Smith. It is also relationships. In fact, consider the opposite. In order to reduce water leakages in London, the water company has reduced water pressure from over 3 bar to just over 1 bar. So in the meantime, tens of thousands of homeowners in multi-story housing have had to install water pressure pumps, consuming electricity, to get the system pressure back to normal for drinking waters and showers. Overall wealth has been reduced because they can't rely on stable communal water provision. So in short, our definitions of abundance and wealth rely on what we can count on in wider society. And taken together, liquid money shows that even a narrow economic definition of wealth depends on the state, and the threshold of abundance is often set by what we can or can't count on the state, our community of fellow citizens, to provide. So, how might we reframe wealth? I would suggest we might examine risk-reward analysis. Let's call this enhancement. I often contend there are only 4 big strategic decisions, namely, what game am I playing, reducing risk, enhancing reward, and increasing certainty. Once you have committed to a game, say, I want to run a fish and chip shop, as opposed to I want to run a laundromat or I want to retire, then there are only 3 decisions left. So risk-reward evaluation or enhancement can be summarized in 3 diagrams. So imagine you've decided to stay in the game and run a fish and chip shop, where the cash generated from current operations could range from on budget, the 0 mark here in this diagram, to a lot more cost, minus 100 over on the far left, or a lot less cost, plus 100 on the far right, and you'll make a lot of profit. You really only have 3 generic activities at your disposal. The first generic activity is risk reduction. You look to ensure that by making decisions, using better skills or knowledge or pooling or insurance, you eliminate particularly adverse outcomes. For instance, you might build a retaining wall for storing hazardous frying oils. Now, managers typically look most of the time at a second class of generic activity, reward enhancement. Reward enhancement comes through cost reduction via increased productivity, improved workplace satisfaction, or better contracting or relocation. A whole range of management decisions may lead to improved outcomes. And these decisions shift outcomes positively to the right in this diagram. But finally and subtly, the last activity that can be done is that there are activities that increase certainty and reduce volatility by more consistently delivering on cost or income, and thus tightening the range of possibilities. If the financial case is not made by risk avoidance or reward enhancement, actions that increase costs can still be good financial bets if they reduce volatility. For instance, giving better deals on long-term contracts to ensure more stable income, or investing in education in order to ensure a supply of skilled labor, are actions that reduce future volatility. Now, in this example, all three activities, risk reduction, reward enhancement, and increased certainty, combine to help move your fish and chip shop from a starting range of -100 to +100 with a mean of 0 to a range of perhaps -50 to +115 with a mean of 10, and a much higher likelihood of hitting that mean. I won't go into the technicalities, but very, very importantly, we can actually use options theory to put a financial value on this volatility reduction. You can see here too that abundance becomes more certain. A level of wealth is arrived at earlier and worth more if there is less uncertainty. In a practical case, years ago, I argued that pensioners don't just want money. For example, pensioners also want electricity in retirement. Money is just a means of getting it. And pensioners are prepared to pay today for future electricity without the volatility of how much money might buy electricity in the future. In Scandinavia today, such long-term futures for retirement can actually be bought. Well, we've seen unprecedented wealth transfers over the past few decades. For a start, these include wealth transferred from the young to the old via the housing market, from the young to the old, healthy to the unhealthy via the health service, from the private sector to the public sector via public sector growth and taxation, from private sector employees to public sector employees via state pensions, from the rich and poor and middle-aged to the middle-class young via education, from the real economy to the financial services sector, from savers to borrowers and the credit-worthy to the feckless via defaults, public bailouts, and inflation, and from the wealthy to the poor via taxation or debt relief. Wealth distribution and inequality are huge issues in our time. Think of Thomas Piketty or Sustainable Development Goal 10 to reduce inequality within and among nations. Just imagine that you had all the money in the world. What would it be worth? Are you thinking about that? All the money, what would it be worth? Nothing. Money is useless. Other people would go off and do something else. Money is really only worth something if it's distributed. And distributing money and wealth through time is perhaps the biggest challenge for governance. Anyone who has served on a pension board knows this. One of our biggest problems in finance is that short-term feedback tends to be positive, encouraging bubbles, while long-term feedback tends to be negative, and this means we learn very slowly. Tacitus observed that posterity gives to every man his true honor. We think about our posterity when we think about these long-term transfers. Some people invoke seventh generation sustainability. This is a concept attributed to the Iroquois that all major decisions should take the next 7 generations into account. From the great binding law of the Iroquois, written in the 15th century, it says, "Look and listen for the welfare of the whole people, and have always in view not only the present, but also the coming generations, even those whose faces are yet beneath the surface of the ground, the unborn of the future nation." There is a much attributed quotation that highlights this change of direction. The world was not given to us by our parents, but loaned to us by our children. We contract with future generations in lots of unnoticed ways. As per this diagram, healthcare, education, welfare, life expectancies, etc. I would point out things like fish, landfill arrangements, climate change, education, and pensions. Now here's a good question for you about your pension. If you felt wealthy, you might consider much of your pension as abundance. If you thought your pension was abundant, would you surrender some of your monies today to others? I suspect the answer is no. There are just too many uncertainties ahead to ever think your pension is safe. And this underscores my earlier points about the cost of volatility, or its mirror, the value of increasing certainty. Now, good governance requires us to consider increasing certainty in the round. Some of these questions are very tough. Here are a few. Pension investments. Do pensioners want to have lots of money, but retire into a ravished world? Do pension fund trustees have an obligation to help build a better future world, not just a pension pot? How far do trustees need to consider things like climate change? Should trustees invest in fossil fuels because they are investments that increase wealth, or not invest because it leads to a world their pensioners would find overall less wealthy to retire into? Commercial firms. If we look to corporate boards, what timescale should directors ponder? Forever, because they have an unrealistic and improbable view that their organization will never die? Should they look a lifetime ahead, to the end of their likely stint, just till tomorrow? Options increase in value as volatility increases, thus rewarding managers who create volatility in their company shares. Options, ab initio, divide the interests of managers and shareholders. So should governors ever use options for management remuneration rather than time-restricted equity or longer-term incentives based on competitive benchmarks? Should employee share plans be mandatory, not just for productivity, well-being, inclusion, and equality, but as part of general long-term environmental, social, and governance thinking? And finally, a third area, working with wider society. Should governors of all organizations be investing in social and physical infrastructure, from improvements to diversity and access to education, to sewers, roads, and vaccinations, because such investments will reduce wider volatility? Or should they stick to their knitting? I move towards a close here by sharing some more conceptual implications for governance that tries to increase social certainty. This is where tough questions lead to 4 tough territories that I would like to see explored in more boardrooms. The first is technology. How do you set the odds for technological advance responsibly? Think of introducing a mobile phone application in a country where a smartphone is a significant fraction of income, but then you decide to drop the product line after 6 months, leaving some African family more destitute than when you arrived. Yet governors have to assess the odds of technology. All of those climate change examples disappear if your board believes there is a silver bullet way of putting carbon dioxide back in the earth. Socialism versus capitalism. Support for free markets does not equate to support for capitalism. The ownership of the means of production clearly merits discussion, but what all might agree upon is that making choices in free markets is a fundamental part of human freedom. A third area that this moves us towards, economics. If markets are a fundamental part of human freedom, do governors want to go further and extend their governance to properly functioning markets? A corrupt market taints all participants. Do governors have a moral interest, not just to serve as agents for their own organization, but to serve as agents for the system as a whole? And finally, political. Is there a need to have a systemic interest in classical liberalism, We are governors operating within a current market-based framework. In governing for the future, how much of the full liberal system should we support? Freedom of speech, free markets, free trade, individual rights, including civil rights and human rights, protection of property, and limited government? Well, a big danger, of course, is that by trying to enchant everything, we focus on nothing. But the questions remain valid. Danny Hillis has a golden rule of time. Do for the future what you're grateful the past did for you, or what you wish the past had done for you. Reframing the complexities of wealth raises exceedingly good questions. And good questions are tough questions on technology, society, economics, and politics, even on the nature of money itself. I hope you can work with me on reframing wealth by valuing increased certainty to build a better future constructed on foundations of good governance. I look forward to our discussion, and thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mainelli. That was a great presentation. A lot of questions to discuss further in this discussion on this topic. Lots to unpack. I'm looking forward to it with the rest of our panelists, who I will now introduce and give them 5 minutes each to respond to what you have presented to us. So we have Marlon Yarde, who is the CEO of the Barbados Stock Exchange. We have Claire Gomez-Miller, who is the executive chairman of CLICO in Trinidad and Tobago, and Jacqueline Quamina, who is also in Trinidad and Tobago, who is the director of the Republic Bank Limited. I will start off with giving Claire Gomez-Miller the opportunity to respond to what Professor Mainelli just mentioned to us.
Well, Melissa, it is nice that you can give me that surprise.
I'm sorry, I thought we were all ready.
I like that, you know. Now the professor has given a wide span of ideas in reframing the complexities of wealth. So I must congratulate him on that. I think he has thrown in everything, including the kitchen sink, as one would say. So thank you for that food for thought. We, especially in the Caribbean region, we are not unique to the other nations, I must say, especially within this COVID pandemic. It means that there has been a level playing field, and we can recognize that wealth as we knew it in 2019 is not the same as wealth in 2020, even during the pandemic, and we expect that post-pandemic we will also see a change in how we generate wealth, how we protect our wealth, and how we create wealth. It's a lot of rethinking, re-engineering businesses to at least stay afloat and to survive, even survive when you're looking at, as the saying now is, saving life and saving livelihood. You know, it has come down to where it is saving your organization. It is preserving your organization so that there is life after this pandemic. And the thinking of organizations have to go beyond the unknown, because the unknowns have become the unknown. You never knew some of the challenges that you would have faced in an organization prior to this pandemic. Right? I would like to look at the financial stability of organizations as they move forward in the protection of their wealth. So first, source of funds. What is the industry for your organization? And that will will tell you whether it is that you can survive, whether it is that you have to re-engineer or change out your organization. Right? So the question becomes very relevant when we enter into this phase of the pandemic. But as we said before, we are actually seeing the second phase and the second wave and the third wave seeming to be one wave, which means that as an organization, you don't have much time to respond. So the organization must continue to be very nimble. So that when we see the financial stability severely affected in the cruise and tourism industry, the energy sector, the real estate, especially the residential and commercial rentals and commercial malls, where one would have had a steady stream of income, that source of fund can no longer be relied upon. So for survival, an organization would quickly need to repurpose its assets or change its services and products to ensure there is a steady inflow of funds. And one can look at the cruise ship industry. You saw that they recently, I think is a Carnival, one of them recently reopened their doors, failed to ensure all of the risks were managed. Passengers were allowed to remove their mask after entering the ship, and only to find that within a very short period of time, everyone ended up having to be self-quarantined in their cabins. That is not good for a restart of your business. So it means to say that even though that the experience was gained from the first the first few months of the pandemic, you could have seen where the organization in re-entering the business failed to ensure the learnings from the first experience. And a lot of our organizations can have similar experience if it is that we are not vigilant in learning the lessons of other organizations, along with the lessons that we learned when we entered into that pandemic. So it is very critical for lessons to be learned and ensure that when we reopen or as we continue our operations, our source of funds are protected. That's the main thing here. The capital wealth from our investment portfolios have been hard hit. As you said, Wall Street and stock exchanges have seen days of record-breaking losses of stocks and shares publicly traded within marketplaces, locally, regionally, and internationally. We have seen our balance sheet stripped of assets. All our reserves are not there, as you know. We took for granted that our reserves would be there, but when it is that you're looking at, and we're talking about companies within the energy sector also, even financial institutions that would have had a healthy reserve to support the continuation of their businesses. You're seeing that being affected. So the actual revaluation of your assets can see significant losses from your capital. Though one would have expected that capital gains coming through from your investment portfolio would have tided you over. You would have seen returns on your investment being more or less steady. As it is now, not even government bonds are safe as we had seen them before. So I think not looking at our own organization is not sufficient. Looking at the government reserve, looking at the organizations and also the countries that have been partnering with you within your value chain, whatever support system the organization would have had before, you now need to make sure that there is an understanding of the impact on that organization, because organizations that you would have been doing business with to ensure your own wealth, those organizations would have also been impacted. Closing of borders have impacted. So we need to understand that value chain and ensure that the source of funds and also our capital wealth are protected as we move along. Well, cost management, and I will just speak to more to debt servicing, especially those organizations that were with debt or plan to enter into debt. It means to say that's an additional burden. So gone are the times when an organization could have just prepared a budget. I think before we were talking about our annual budgets that are due at the end of the year, coming into the next year. It's like review of your budget every month. It's not only just your variance reporting, it's actually looking at your cash flow, anticipating that your revenue that you would have been getting from not only investments, but from your sale of goods, sale of services, those have been impacted. So it means that cash flow has to be monitored, and your spend also has to be at the minimum. And I would want to stop here. I have a lot more to say, but at this point, we do yes, who I'm sure we're into.
Absolutely, and I thank you for inputting, carrying us more into a specificity of what's happening to us now, and how we have to use that to actually reframe our version of what wealth is, and from a standpoint of holistic approach between an individual all the way up to the country level. So with that, I'm going to call on Marlon Yarde, the CEO of the Barbados Stock Exchange. Marlon, are you here?
Thank you. Just having difficulty in finding my unmute. I did a presentation. I prepared a presentation. I don't intend to go through the presentation in its entirety, but I'm looking at this perspective. I'm looking at this topic from the perspective of a practitioner in the marketplace, which assists in the creation of wealth. And I want to speak a bit about my own organization, the Barbados Stock Exchange, and why a vibrant capital market is important for facilitating wealth creation. And before I start, let me thank Caribbean Corporate Governance for inviting me to be part of this panel. And also I want to commend our two speakers thus far, in particular our featured speaker, Professor Mainelli. He really opened up my eyes to some things, and sometimes you think of things, but you can't put them in the words that you want to. And I thought the presentation made certain things in my own mind more conceptualized and made it clear in my own mind. Sometimes we at the stock exchange or capital markets, we think about the practicality of things and how things are done to assist people in achieving their financial goals. And very much what Claire had said, all the certainty in our markets, the certainty of, for example, bonds being that investment that is solid and that we can turn to. Even governments at this stage, they are under a lot of pressure to supply the services and goods and services and social services that governments are there for, but they are challenged by the revenue streams that come their way. So we're all in a topsy-turvy position as it relates to how we survive and how we also continue to be able to find ways to create wealth for ourselves. Now, I believe, and I continue to believe, that the capital markets are very important to the development of and creation of wealth in our societies. So why are capital markets so important? Next slide, please. Or can I move the slides myself? Okay. Skip that one too as well. So why are capital markets important? What are they anyway? So the term capital markets in a nutshell describes the system of allocating capital in an economy between suppliers of capital, known as investors, and users of capital, known as borrowers. There are oftentimes businesses, but also governments and even individuals who supply this capital, who use this capital. Financial intermediaries usually facilitate this exchange. Think of banks, for example, when they transfer deposits from one hand into loans, mortgages, etc. On the other hand. Further, think of stock exchanges like the Barbados Stock Exchange, the Trinidad and Tobago Stock Exchange, Jamaica Stock Exchange, Eastern Caribbean Stock Exchange, who facilitate the trading of shares between investment bankers or hedge funds, known typically as institutional investors, or between individual mom and pop investors known as retail investors. So these are the three key parties in the capital market: the supplier of capital, the financial intermediaries, and the users of capital. So what is the role of the stock exchange? Next slide, please. Why are stock exchanges important? Can't we just deal with companies directly? Can I just trade shares directly with my friends? Can I just trade bonds directly with other people? Well, yes, you can in both instances, but you still might not get the best price if you plan on trading frequently. Stock exchanges, capital markets provide a marketplace where you can get the best price discovery for your securities. Stock exchanges play a critical intermediary role. Whilst we exist primarily to provide liquidity in the marketplace. So what does that mean exactly? Let me make it clear. Let's say you're an owner of a private company. For example, it's really difficult for persons outside your company to know the real value of some of the shares you might be offering privately. It's even harder for those persons, if they bought your shares, to be able to trade those shares or sell their shares to another person. I remember the whole purpose of people buying securities is for at some point in time, they want to convert that security into cash to meet their specific financial objectives, be it converting it into another asset, for example, property, house, land, whatever, a car, or it could be more long-term goal, providing income for themselves at some point in the future when they retire. They're not just, so they're trying to create wealth for themselves for some use at some future point in time, or for immediate use to meet ongoing expenses. So stock exchanges provide that marketplace so that people can get the best price for their security, dependent on the underlying economic conditions at the time. So so stock exchanges help remove the opacity that can be effectively created in a true market and for your shares, or for the shares for shares that you may own. And essentially, we act as a bridge between market actors, that is individual investors, institutional investors, and listed companies. So by listing your company publicly, you can launch what is known as an initial public offering, or IPO, which is the initial sale of your stock to an initial group of or consortium of investors. This initial primary sale is called the primary market for your stocks. And stock exchanges, however, facilitate a secondary market, which is where those initial purchases of your company's shares from the primary market get to sell those shares to each other or the wider investing public. So effectively, our facilitation to buy and sell for a buy and sell ecosystem for the secondary market allows for dynamic, transparent price discovery of a company's shares, and it allows investors to create wealth for themselves. There's more I can say at this point in time, but suffice it to say that the capital markets allow persons to create wealth for themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Marlon, for that discussion on the stock exchange. And I definitely will come back to you with questions regarding how that relates to how people view their wealth in the future, especially as we think about what Professor Mainelli spoke about in terms of reframing our thought process of the security of our future and what we personally think our securities are. I'm going to now call on Jacqueline Quamina, who is a consultant in corporate law, governance, and banking in Trinidad and Tobago. But before I ask you to start, Jacqueline, I just want to mention to everyone that after Jacqueline goes, I'm going to have Professor Mainelli respond back to the three panelists. And then I'm going to open up for discussion. So if you have any questions, please start putting them into the chat so we can make sure they're answered before the session is over. Jacqueline, can we have you on?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. It's certainly a pleasure to be here. It's been a long but absolutely fascinating day. A lot of interesting discussions. Where to begin here? First of all, I want to reframe, well, as we've been asked to do, reframe wealth in a time of COVID. What is wealth? And then do that in terms of companies, because we're talking about corporate governance, and take the interpretation of wealth a little further, in that it is not just your bottom line, it is not just your profitability. And we have to look in particular at what COVID has taught us, what this period has taught us. So I'm reframing wealth in a time of COVID, so to speak. And I think if I go back historically, and I mentioned it a bit earlier this morning when I spoke briefly, we have always looked in the Caribbean, and I'm trying to put in a Caribbean context, of business in silos. We look at business, we looked at CSR, the good works we do, and we looked at governance. And they're sort of three separate silos, and they weren't interconnected. And if you are in an organization, your organization would have three separate departments. You would have your finance department or your business department that interacted with your publics, and you would have your marketing CSR department, and you would have your people who dealt with governance, and there was no interaction. And I think what COVID has taught us is that that is not possible. There has to be interaction. There is each area is dependent on the other, and the creation of wealth or your profitability and your bottom line cannot be based solely on your business. The pandemic has affected the way in which we do business and has caused us to step back and take a look at the whole framework within which we operate. Now, I think in the Caribbean, we're lagging a bit. I initially said that we started off with the corporate governance codes, and that was our initial introduction to governance in the Caribbean. And since 2013 in Trinidad and Tobago, when we introduced that, we've done very little in that respect. We still rely on those corporate governance codes and what they taught us. At the same time, during that period, we were developing CSR, and that became the sort of catchword. And people would dedicate 3-4 pages in their annual reports to CSR, showing all the good works they have done. But as I said, they were desperate, absolutely separate, and not interconnected. Now I'm going to borrow a sort of analysis from Andrew Hill, who is an associate editor with the Financial Times. And he described the impact of the pandemic in this way. He said the first impact was we saw the erosion of shareholder value. Then it taught us there was an interconnectivity in the economic ecosystem. Everything was connected. And then the third thing he pointed out, and which I think really had value, but I hadn't thought of it before, was that it changed the relationship between companies and the government, because you did see private enterprise stepping up to the mark to assist government in a crisis. You know, we're handing out laptops, helping with food baskets, and many other ways in which aren't necessarily public. The corporate world stepped up to try and help the situation. And I think there was a general recognition there that you cannot have profitability unless your society and your communities and everyone was happy. They all interconnected and they all moved together. And this leads us on, and I would like to sort of introduce there, as it has been before, the concept of ESG. And that is where the Caribbean is lagging. We haven't really reached that stage in our governance development yet, using governance as the overarching umbrella under which all of this comes. Where we do see it is in some of the larger, maybe companies that have foreign shareholders. RBC uses it, Unilever is very important at it. Some of the energy sector companies have it, but our local companies have been slow to introduce that. I'm very proud to say that Republic Financial Holdings has actually signed on to the principles of responsible banking. So we're going to see some development there. And I'm hoping other companies, although the practices there, will pull it together and we will see some analysis based not only on financial matrix, but ESG analysis. So we will actually see where these companies are going and it will be measurable. No company can exist in abstract alone. The professor pointed out there's risk reduction, reward enhancement, and increased certainty. All of that has to go into the package in order to produce wealth in its wider context at the end of the day. We have suffered from a global shock. The long-term goal has to be sustainability, that our companies, our operations will continue to exist. And I think wealth has to be viewed in that context now. It's not the bottom line. It is how we interact with our societies, our communities, our environment. All of that has suddenly come to the fore and become more important. And I think companies do realize it. There was a little bit of cynicism, I think, earlier on whether that has in fact been recognized. My cursory look at companies in Singapore, in India, in other countries in the world, it has been taken on board and it has been recognized that COVID has had a direct impact on business and it has to be factored into the way we do calculate and go forward. Sustainability is the end game. Long term, not short term. We have to survive. And that's where the shareholder is going to look. And that gives rise to sustainable investing and the principles of sustainable investing, long-term investing. And that's where investors are looking now. It's an important factor in the making of any investment. I think really that's in a nutshell what I wanted to say. The thing to say anything more after all these wonderful speakers is going to be repetitive. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Michael, I'm going to ask you to respond, but I would also say, you know, we've heard all our panelists talk about how to address this within the corporate governance and how to address it as it relates to what has been going on in the pandemic. And also we've heard about the stock exchange and how that affects the financial wealth of individuals. Now, if we are going to be thinking about it in terms of reframing, as you mentioned before, what does that look like? You know, how do things like thinking in a more societal way or thinking more, thinking about the fact that sometimes the stock exchange is volatile. How do we reframe our thoughts on wealth to be able to accommodate those trends?
Well, thank you, Melissa. My thanks really to Claire for emphasizing the societal aspects, to Marlon about the role of the markets and pointing out some of the moral dimensions, and Jacqueline in particular about the fact that we're in silos and we need to do a lot more holistic thinking. I would respond in a couple of ways, if I might. I mean, the first is that it has long been fashionable to talk about holistic thinking, multidisciplinary thinking, complexity theory. Everything depends on everything else. And it's all really rather complicated, isn't it? And the truth is, well, it is. So, you know, and therefore, Jacqueline's call that we, you know, go away from this type of silo thinking is one that I think we would all support. And our great-grandchildren will probably support it as well, because we have this increasing tension between specialization and integration. But I think it's important as well, if you look at the pandemic, a number of people do make arguments very similar to the fact that it's our very integration that caused the pandemic. This stuff in Wuhan whizzed around the world. Well, that's true, but don't forget that in 1918 it went around the world anyway. It just went around much more slowly. So we are connected whether we like it or not. And I don't think that fighting integration is the right way to do things. And I would also point out that our rise in living standards, really since the 1970s, around 1970, since 1970, trade has expanded, believe it or not, from about 20% of GDP to about 60% of global GDP. So that takes out all the population growth numbers. That's just that increase there, you know, a 220% rise. Amazing when you think about it. But that's what's made us wealthy. Now, it's true that it's not all financial. You know, it's also been trades in ideas, trades in aesthetics, mores, values, culture. You know, there's a lot of other things than just commercial goods and services. And I'm not trying to do it, but one of the things I do have a problem with, and I'm long on the ESG front, that's not my point. You know, I want us to be in an ESG world. The problem is sometimes on the path to getting there, we seem to be creating what I consider to be parallel currencies. So if you look at annual reports at the moment, everybody's got a statement now about climate change. Everybody's got a statement about their carbon stuff. I don't normally care about that kind of thing, do I? Normally I buy your product because it's cheaper than her product. You know, I don't care how you made it. I don't care, you know, why is your product so expensive? Oh, well, it's because, you know, and if you can't sell me on it, you know, it's because it's gold plated and I want gold plate, but you actually say it's because I'm kind of stupid and I have inefficient workers, but you should buy my product anyway. I don't care why you do or you don't. And when you think about carbon, you know, how am I qualified, let alone PwC or Deloitte or Ernst & Young or KPMG for that matter, to tell you what's in your carbon budget? You should take your carbon budget, you take your energy bill, give it to an engineer and let the engineer work it down. I just care about the price and what I'm getting. And we're in real danger here in the ESG space of creating all these parallel currencies. So the annual report is full of this is my carbon budget, this is my risk of child labor, here's the canopy grown coffee beans that I had. And, you know, and at this point, you'll find, which we have found in empirical tests, we gave analysts about 8-9 years ago a set of corporate accounts. It was really interesting to watch them. Basically, I paraphrase only slightly, 30 of them took the corporate accounts, opened it up, found the place the financial numbers started, ripped the front half off and threw it in the bin. Because they don't care. They don't believe any of this guff and it's not quantitative. So to me, the end goal has got to be to remove a lot of these externalities where we can. I think we as corporate governance people should be fighting for that. We should be saying on climate change, we need to get a price for it. It's not, you know, we need to have a tax, or we need to have, I happen to be a proponent of tradable permits, but it doesn't matter. The point is, once the price is there, I don't need a separate ESG report for it. My product is more or less expensive, just as it applies to landfill taxes and all sorts of other things. Now, there's two items to that. One, it's not always achievable easily, as we've seen on climate change, for example. And two, it can be quite legitimate on the path to getting there to produce some of these side currencies temporarily. But I think we as a corporate governance group of people should be saying, if you want good governance, you have to make it simple. We have very good financial governance mechanisms. So if there's a good way of getting into the financial governance system, could we please do that and fight for that before we go and create too many parallel currencies? So thank you very much, Jacqueline, for inspiring the bit on silos.
I think those are great points. And I would want to take it a little bit further in terms of, you're now saying that we need to create these different currencies to kind of bring everything together. And I hope I'm understanding what you're saying. But then we bring it back to a currency, right? And a currency being wealth. But if we go back into your presentation and talking about reframing what wealth is, do we really need to create currencies, or do we need to take a step back and figure out how another way that we are valuing these things?
Mm-hmm.
The thing that you spoke about in terms of our world being on loan from our grandchildren. I think that's a very valuable. It's one of my favorite phrases, actually. That's something that brings a lot of value, because then you instinctively want to do better things, and this is where the things like climate change and those kinds of things come in and trump the monetary values that you're bringing in or charging for your products. So how do we balance that? How do we balance the idea of, so I am one of those on the border millennials. So that means that I had the previous generation of no technology, and then also now all of this technology. And I see this change where people value happiness more. And, how do we put a value on that happiness? And how do we facilitate things like the mere fact that we are thinking about retirement means that we're putting some kind of we're placing the value of retirement on an end, on death, basically. But if we place a value on something like lifelong learning, and we're never striving towards retirement, does our wealth look different? And also, Marlon, I wanted to also pose to you the notion that the stock exchange is volatile. What if I invest in all of these things in one type of stock that just ends up, it's been doing fantastic for the last 20 years, and then all of a sudden it dives, it takes a dive. And for Claire, about pensions, I've seen where I've had a family member bet all of their life on their pension, and then someone came, took over the company, and all of that was out the door. How do we now help people to reframe what wealth means, and that wealth is not a wealth that you accumulate up to your retirement, but wealth is something that is continuously with you, and so you're valuing it more. What are your thoughts on that? Anyone want to go first?
Let me start first. I first, let me validate what you're saying as it relates to, and now this is taking me out of my stock exchange mode now, but valuing life and your experiences and learning and educating yourself more above, say, putting money aside for retirement. You got to do these things. These things are important, but meanwhile, you need to live and add value to your life and the people around you. And this is a conversation. The older you get, and like myself, the older I get, the more I think about these things. Before, when I was a lot younger, it's all about, you got to accumulate wealth, you got to save for retirement, you got to do this. And meanwhile, you're sacrificing your experiences now. And I've come to the conclusion, and this is discussions between myself and my wife too. We've come to this conclusion, we make sure we set aside and we have a framework to retire. But let us enjoy what we have now, because we don't know. I tell people, you walk around in life and you do not know what is going on in your body, and then all of a sudden something happens, and all these grand plans you had for the future, your focus now is on surviving, getting over this particular. And then you're thinking about leaving something for your children. Let the children do what you've been doing all your life. working hard and enjoying yourself, you know, let them do that. I mean, not that you're going to forget them and not put aside something for them, but let them work for it, because you always, you know, and again, referring to conversations with my wife, you know, we have one child, a daughter. You do all this, you save all this, and then as you say, some sweet skin Bucky comes along and in one fell swoop destroys or eradicates everything you've done. So that is one thing. You need to live and experience life as you go along. Now, going back to the stock exchange, this is something I'm a little bit more comfortable with. You know, what we do here is, from time immemorial, there has been volatility in markets. We go through cycles. And sometimes what you have to look at is the long game as opposed to the short term. And when you look at stock market's performance, say over 100 years, 75 years, say there's on average, the rate of return has been in the region of 11%, even when you consider what has happened, 11%, even when you would have considered what happened in the financial crisis, 2007, 2008, now what is happening now, markets tend to rebound. So that over the long term, things will tend to trend upwards. The other thing is, simple old adage people say, don't put all your eggs in one basket. So even when you want to invest, I always like to tell people, you invest not only within an asset class, you invest across asset classes, so that when something affects a particular asset class, you have other investments in other types of assets that may not be affected in the same way. Sometimes assets have an inverse relationship to one another. When one goes up, another one might come down, and vice versa. So invest within. If you're buying securities, you know, diversify within the asset class, but also diversify across asset classes. And I think I've answered your question, right? Good. I'll let somebody else take over.
All right. So I think mine was around managing your, I should say, protecting your pension fund per se. Yes. Pension fund, like anything else, you know, steeped with uncertainties, because you trust that the organization and that employed you when you were 24, 25 would be the organization 30, 35 years later in your life when you reach that pensionable age. And what we are finding here, it's that's not the norm. Also too, you have a lot more contractual engagements as against permanent employment. And we have not been seeing organizations making that change to allow for pension plans for even temporary or contract employees. And that is so sad, because what you're having within the workplace is less persons contributing to the pension plan. So the more contracted workers, the less permanent workers, the less healthy your pension plan can be. So what you really and truly want is a rethinking within the organization. And I think where we are looking at those types of decisions being made within the boardroom now need to think of not only addressing that need for their permanent personnel, but also everyone who's employed within that organization. Some organizations may invest in specific short-term plans for the employee, so that the employee can, it may be like a mutual fund or something similar, that the employee can move from one organization to another organization with whatever instrument that is invested in for the security of the employee in the later years must be duly considered. It must be considered from the context of the stability of the organization that's providing that type of service or product. And so we want to make sure that there is some level of assurance that that organization will also be there 30, 35 years down the road, so that they can get their returns. You don't want a failed organization. So there must be, again, continuous monitoring of any pension plan or similar plans that an organization engages in for the benefit of the employees. The individuals, I believe that they also must take some level of responsibility for their future wealth. And that is to see that developing themselves to make sure that there is a skill, there is some competencies, some knowledge that the future will require them, that there is an earning capacity, regardless of whether they hit that 60, 65, 70 years of age. Because what you're actually seeing here is there are countries that are actually moving the goalpost for the retirees. 1 minute you can retire at 60, and the next minute say, no, you can only retire at 65. And then they say, no, 70. By the time you get around to your retirement age, you're dead. And they hope that you die long before you reach your retirement age. So those of us who actually want to get the benefit of retirement age, we want to make sure that we understand our pension plans. We need to invest interest in that, and not set it aside until we are about 2 years or so to our retirement age, and then say, hey, I want to know how much money am I going to get? Am I going to get a lump sum? Is that quantity that I'm going to get on a monthly basis, that allow me to survive? And at that point in time, you're spending more money in the pharmacies and at the doctor's office than in the grocery and the parties. Those ESSA parties would be a thing of the past. You need more clothes as you get older. So I think look at it from the perspective of ensuring that you can survive at whatever age it may be. Another critical thing is that debt management. And I think everyone must look at their debt. Forget about the financial institution telling you that, you can invest your 30 or 40% of your revenue stream in a loan and come take a loan. The point here is, as you get older, you really and truly want to start reducing that debt, so that regardless of whatever happens, you don't have that debt servicing to take place in your later years. So I would stop here and allow my fellow participants and presenters to get an opportunity to be on the floor.
Jacqueline, Michael, you have anything to respond to this with?
I just have one little thing to add, which was the new buzzword, I think, is sustainability.
Yes.
And if there is sustainability, your pension plan and also your future with your wife, Marlon, will be intact. It's a question, and again, I'm going to go back to what Professor Mainelli said, and it's words I wrote down because I'm going to be using them, I think, going forward a lot. Risk reduction, reward enhancement, and increased certainty. I like that. It gives me a nice sort of comfortable, warm feeling, which I think all maybe adds up to sustainability at the end of the day, long-term sustainability.
I like that. I think that coming off of something that you said and also Claire just mentioned, I think we should also probably take a look at health being one of the main wealth categories for individuals, something that we don't really talk about so much. But before I get into that, I'm going to go to the chat box, and I see that Camille Facey has posed a question. She says, I understood Professor Mainelli to say that we need to avoid creating side currencies and to find a way to incorporate ESG into financial results. Taxes are usually an effective way. How else could we do this?
Well, thank you, Camille, for that. And in many ways, building oddly on this bit about sustainability, I think all of this is about governance in the long term. In fact, in London, I've been running for 15 years something called Long Finance, which is asking when would we know our financial system is working. All the materials are free and online, and you're welcome to browse it. We've brought out hundreds of publications and had, I think, 1,000 events recently. I think we hit that mark, where people are talking about different aspects of it. But to your question, you're absolutely correct. I was saying that ideally you want to have one currency if you can, and I'll explain that and then come on to some of the other ways. The reason is let's say that I have, and Melissa, I'm about to pick on you, I'm terribly sorry, but we have evil Melissa and we have wonderful Jacqueline, and they both work for me, okay? And evil Melissa comes in one day and says, you know, what's my bonus going to be, boss? And I say, well, you know, Melissa, you've been terrible. I mean, you polluted that river. You're wanted on 3 sexual harassment charges. You went to, yeah, but boss, I've got the
I'm
best
terrible.
performing division in the company. Darn, you know, and I deserve it because I've made the most profit. And Jacqueline, sweetie, comes in and says, you know, well, you know, we lost a lot of money this year, but, you know, but the best thing is my staff morale ratings are high. You know, I haven't gone to jail. Nobody in my place is going to jail. We've won an environmental award for recycling, etc. And I would like a big bonus. Yeah, but you lost a lot of money. Yeah, well, that's just one measure. I mean, you know, come on, Michael, get real. And this is the problem. A genuine manager has to turn that into a financial decision. Whatever society likes to say, it comes down to it. So if we can bring these currencies together, it helps. Now, I do say that there are limits. How can you do it? Well, you're absolutely right on taxes. One of the biggest things is externalities. We typically don't value externalities. So climate change is a classic. It just is an externality. You can pollute and nobody cares. We're trying to do something about it very slowly. Another thing that you can do is you can find long-term ways of binding people together so that they really do have a stake in the future of the decision. You know, if you take pensions, for example, a pension advisor who actually benefits alongside your investment is more likely to stick around if you keep that low but long term. So they're taking longer decisions and bound into it and helping you to make a better decision. So a lot of things like that can be done. But one of the things I would point to is going to sound very moralistic, but it's true, that the golden rule really matters. You know, do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Or there is, of course, the positive version, you know, don't do unto others that which would not be done unto you. But the point being that really thinking about others. And if you take that point of view, you wind up in some really weird circumstances. I hate beggars. London is full of beggars. And I walk through London and there's somebody begging. But the minute that I think of it from the golden rule point of view, you know, I would say if I was sitting there in rags looking up with my cat, you're telling me you can't afford a few pounds to give me? And the truth is that frankly breaks my heart and I crack. I really would like to get rid of beggars off the streets because they're a sign of something else. But it's that golden rule principle. And one of the things that's really good, and this is a Caribbean bit, I've only been to the Caribbean a handful of times, Antigua, Bahamas, Cayman, etc. But in being there, you've got lovely countries that are communities. It's much more communitarian. And I come from Ireland, and one of the problems in Ireland is it is also an island, you know, and everybody knows everybody. You got to be extremely careful on an island not to offend people, because you're going to have to live with them, no matter what happens. In larger countries, you know, I can offend you and walk away. The beggar's not going to find me. But I then find out on an island that the beggar is actually the brother of somebody that I really want to do something with, and I've insulted him. So you've got to watch it. Now, a friend of mine, James Briding, lives in Switzerland. He's Swiss, and he wrote a really cool book last year called Too Small to Fail. And he looked at 8 nations, and the 8 nations he looked at were what he considered on a whole variety of measures to be the most successful. And I won't get them all, but it was both Switzerland, of course, Ireland, the Netherlands, Sweden, Denmark, Singapore, Israel, and I've forgotten one. But anyway, you get the gist of it. Those sorts of countries, very thriving, successful, small countries. Now, Jim wasn't saying that small countries are always successful, but he was pointing out that these small countries are actually more successful than all other larger countries. In other words, the notion that large countries have an economy of scale seems to peter out somewhere. Remember, the Netherlands, the largest of his group, is 17 million. So at 17 million, they're doing fine at a global level. So we can do it. But he points out what's interesting about them is the cohesive community in that. And so this comes back to you again, Pocmi. You know, can you make it a community thing in some way? Eleanor Ostrom, the famous Nobel laureate economist who died 5-6 years ago, she wrote about, you know, there aren't tragedies of the commons alone. There are also, in fact, very many successful managements of commons. She looked at the Huertas, She looked at all sorts of various systems, forestry systems in Japan. Why am I going through that? Well, there seem to be 4 long-term pieces of wealth that those 8 countries got right. You touched on one right there when you picked it up. I love that. Health was definitely one. Education was a second. The environment was the third, and pensions were the fourth. And note that all 4 of those are long-term problems. So the long-term wealth issues fall into those 4 categories. And I've had the privilege of going to every single country that James happens to bring up in the book. And I would agree with him completely that when I go into those 3, the health system is superior to what I'm used to. The education system gets excellent ratings internationally. The environment is well catered, well managed, well cared for, and the elderly are taken care of. And those are, I think, the 4 characteristics. And you can do it as a small country, but you've got to bind it together as a community. And this is where that tension comes between money and community. We tend to think of money as cold and hard and brittle and metallic tasting or something, and that community is just warm and cuddly and fuzzy. And the truth is, it's not. You know, when we were looking at microfinance in developing countries, and everybody was very excited about it, about that in economics 20 years ago. You may remember Grameen Bank, and everybody was thrilled about it. What nobody wanted to talk about was what happened when the debt wasn't paid. You know, so Kamala, takes a loan from the microfinance group for a cow, but then decides she doesn't feel like repaying it. I got news for you. Everybody took her around the back of the bike shed and beat her to a pulp until she paid them back because they were on the queue as well. People don't like to talk about it. Community is not a friendly, fuzzy word. It's a real word. And anthropologists define it as I started there. It's very much amongst most anthropologists, the definition that kind of binds them all together is a community is a group of people prepared to be indebted to one another. And so if we're prepared to be indebted, prepared to obey the golden rule, then a lot of this will incorporate ESG into it naturally.
Just to pick up on what you just said, I mean, in Barbados, we had a term in the previous administration. We're more than just an economy, we're a society, and it encapsulates exactly what you're saying.
Awesome. We are running into the end. We're at 5 minutes. So I would just like to say thank you to all of you for having this discussion and imparting all this wonderful knowledge on our guests. And I would say if you have any final words, I'll give you like 1 minute each. And then I'll move it over back to Camille to close out the day's sessions. No final words? Claire, you're speaking. It's you're on mute.
I was saying, what should be our final words? You know, it's always a pleasure being given this platform to speak on matters. And I think I try to make sure that I keep it as simple as possible, because at the end of the day, all of us have, we have the knowledge. We may specialize in certain areas, but it comes back down to what are the basics. And I think the professor alluded to that in his presentation, that you remove all the fluff in your financial statements, all of the fancy words, etc. It comes down to what are the essential elements, what makes that organization, and as we said before, a sustainable organization, an organization that you'd want to do business with, that you'd want to invest in, and not only money, but time also. So I think understanding what are the essential factors for your organization, especially as we keep saying, within this period of high uncertainties. There are lots of unknowns. So understanding our relationships, understanding how we work within the community, within the wider global community. I think we just need to be more conscious of that. And as I said before, just try and keep it simple.
I would end by paraphrasing words in a good book. You love God with all your heart and soul, and you love your neighbor as you love yourself. And that encapsulates basically what Michael was saying before. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
Any final words, Jacqueline?
No, I think I'm all right. I'll leave it right where I have it. Thanks. Leave it right where it is. Thank you very much.
Oh, perfect. Thank you all. I would say my final words would be to, as those leading the organizations, to really pay attention, find out, ask what are the important factors to the people within the organization, what does wealth mean to them, and then try and see how that can be facilitated within the entire process of how you now facilitate and change what wealth looks like within your organization. Thank you, Kamla, for having me on to moderate this panel. It has been a pleasure, and I'll give it back to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Melissa. You did a great job.
Thank you.
Thank you. Also, I want to invite Professor Garrett, if he would want to share any closing thoughts with us as we end day one of our two-day conference here. And while he thinks that through, I want to share that I really appreciated this session because we do talk a lot around it. As corporate bodies, we know that the financial bottom line is important, but the discussion certainly had started moving a long time ago, being picked up by strategic tools like the balanced scorecard and so. And when we begin to talk about governance, we began to now include corporate social responsibility and now ESG. And hopefully Professor Garrett will take that even further into, understanding all the elements of what is important to us. And I think Professor Mainelli really helped bring that home, and again, when he was given his closing remarks, as he said, you're reframing wealth. What really should we be looking at as our wealth? And Claire mentioned it as our future wealth as well. So, and Jacqueline said it as sustainability, which Marlon underscored as well. Wealth in terms of our health, our education, our relationships with each other. So essentially, it's the quality of lives that we lead. And do we understand and appreciate it enough? Our discussions in the boardroom reflects that we value these things. That's I thought this was really awesome from that respect. So Professor Garrett, may I ask you to close today's session?
Well, I'd like to thank everyone. It's just, you've just taken away the words I'd written down to speak. I think if, as we're recording this, I would suggest everybody listens again to the last 5 minutes of Mike's presentation, going over those very issues of health, education, environment, and then respect for the elderly, because it's all in there. I'm not going to repeat it, but we'll certainly take it with us into tomorrow. So Mike, thank you very much indeed. And thank you, the panel members. And I look forward to seeing you all, whatever it is, midday tomorrow.